Hello, welcome to our continued discussion of PepsiCo's 2014 annual report. This video will focus on its accounts receivable disclosure and ratios we can use to analyze its receivables. So looking deeper within PepsiCo's 2014 annual report for more information about receivables, we start with the balance sheet on page 71, then go to the footnotes, note 14 in particular. So if we look at PepsiCo's balance sheet, we're just looking at the assets now. They report one line for accounts and notes receivable net, so they do not separate out accounts receivable from notes receivable, and on the face of the balance sheet they don't give any information about the allowance for doubtful accounts that is deducted to get the net figure. Notice that receivables are about a little less than 10% of total assets, so 6.7 billion compared to 70.5 billion. If we dig a little deeper into note 14, this happens to be the note for PepsiCo, it isn't the same note for every company, we can find out more about these receivables. First of all, what do customers actually owe PepsiCo? And that's gross receivables, the amount due. Most of these come from customers, which are called trade receivables, and there are a few other receivables that they do not give details about because they're not material. To get from gross receivables to the amount on the balance sheet, we deduct the allowance for doubtful accounts, or PepsiCo's estimate of how many receivables will prove uncollectible. Note that this is very small for PepsiCo. If the allowance for doubtful account is 137 billion and gross receivables are 6.8 billion, this is very small, and PepsiCo can decide not to deliver soda to the customers anymore, or syrups or snack food. So PepsiCo has pretty good leverage because it has a product that's in demand. It gives you details about the allowance. It was bigger at the beginning of the year. It increased this year for bad debt expense of $38 billion. It went down, as we learned in our books, when we write off receivables, when receivables from prior years actually turn out to be uncollectible. The bad debt expense is just our estimate of that. There are some other complications, too, which reduce the allowance for doubtful accounts that are beyond the scope of this course. So we learned a little bit more to get to those net receivables of 6.6, almost 6.7 billion on the balance sheet. What can we do with ratios? Well, one ratio is accounts receivable turnover, and this is net credit sales over average net accounts receivable. To calculate this ratio for PepsiCo or for your company, you'll need this year's income statement and this and last year's balance sheet. So you need two pieces of information, and balance sheets contain 2 years worth of comparison, so you have that sort of information potentially available. Well, financial statement analysis is a bit of an art because the things they ask you to look for the book may not exactly be there, so you do the best you can. They ask for net credit sales, but we only have net sales. If we don't have details about how much sales were credit and how much sales were cash, we can just take net sales, assuming that most sales are credit sales. For a company like PepsiCo that sells to that's a wholesaler that sells to retailers instead of direct to consumers, this is probably a decent assumption. However, a company like McDonald's that sells to consumers using cash or even credit cards that are not their own credit cards, but bank credit cards, that's not such a good idea, and the numbers might look like we collect things faster than we actually do. Net accounts receivable this year. Well, we don't have net accounts receivable. We have accounts and notes receivable net. There's no breakout that we can deduct notes receivable, so we just take what we have. And we can get the 2013 information from this year's balance sheet. However, if I want to compare this over 2 years and compare PepsiCo's 2014 receivables turnover to its 2013 one, I looked up the net accounts receivable from 2012 from the 2013 annual report. In 2014, PepsiCo collected its receivables on average 9.8 times a year. Higher receivable turnover indicates more efficient credit management, other things being equal. Using accounts receivable turnover, PepsiCo was more liquid in 2014. Its receivables were collected and turned into cash 9.8 times instead of 9.5 times a year. Because this is not always a ratio that resonates if you're talking to someone who hasn't looked at financial ratios, an easier way to say this is to convert the receivables turnover ratio into the average collection period. Just like the other ratio, it's just doing one more step to the prior ratio. You need this year's income statement and this and last year's balance sheet. Using the prior slide's calculation, since we calculated accounts receivable turnover, divide 365 by 2014 accounts receivable turnover, and we get that we collect receivables on average every 37 days in 2014. This is faster than it was by a little bit in 2013. So, lower average collection period, lower days it takes you to collect and convert receivables to cash, is better for it makes better efficient receivables management, other things being equal. Using the average collection period, PepsiCo was more liquid. This ratio is often easier for people to understand. So a higher accounts receivable turnover, which is good, which is more liquid, means a lower average collection period in days, which is liquid, which is good. So, please feel free to use this presentation as a review before finding the receivables disclosures and calculating the average collection period for your chosen company for 1 year, and you'll compare it to a different company in a different industry after you post your initial discussion. Good luck and get started, Jaspers.